So we shall start. Today's lecture is going to be rip-roaring. I have a lot of material to get through, and I'm completely caffeinated. So if I go very fast, someone has to jump up or wave to me and say, slow down. For those of you who've just come into the room, where the rest of us have been watching Radiohead play the national anthem, and I thought that would be a good occasion to tell you that that isn't actually the national anthem of the United Kingdom. The actual national anthem is called God Save the Queen, which the Sex Pistols, of course, did a great take on in the 1970s, but actually is a song that became popular in the middle of the 18th century, in 1744, 1745. The song is first published then, and it became popular in the aftermath of the attempt of James II's son, the so-called Bonnie Prince Charlie, Prince Charles, the Pretender, to try and land a French-supported army to reconquer Britain and re-establish the Stuart dynasty in Britain, which is something I'm going to be talking about a little bit today. And I should also let you know that the Union Jack that you see here was originally developed in the early 17th century when James VI of Scotland became James I of England and Ireland in 1603, but it wasn't formally adopted as the flag of Great Britain and Ireland until the union with Ireland in 1801. So the story that I'm going to be telling you today is of the development of a new type of state in Britain and the construction of a new type of nation state and a new type of imperial state in the during the 18th century. And this is a pretty remarkable development in lots of ways. We have to start by remembering that during the 17th century, the British Isles had basically been torn apart by civil wars, by rebellions, and by revolutions. Many of those events were bloody and brutal. During the First Civil War in England, between 1642 and 1646, 14% of adult males died. That's a higher proportion than died in the First World War. And during the English invasion of Ireland in 1649 to 1653 under Oliver Cromwell, something like 25 to 50% of the Irish population perished. This was a bloody and traumatic century, the 17th century. And at issue in many of these conflicts was the very legitimacy of the state. Should a monarch or parliament rule? Who had the authority to raise taxes and armies? Should the state have the right to prescribe the religious practice of their subjects, whether Catholic or Protestant? And how could Scotland and Ireland resist or be incorporated within the English state? When the so-called Glorious Revolution occurred in 1688, when basically a bunch of Whig aristocrats in Parliament enacted a coup d'etat that displaced the Catholic King James the Stuart, James II, with his Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband William of Orange, Protestants. Few were sanguine that peace and stability were going to be established. And yet, by 1819, when this lecture is going to end, the British state had become the most secure and arguably the most powerful in the world. It had transformed itself into the United Kingdom with the Acts of Union with Scotland and Ireland in 1707 and 1801, and it had fought an almost perpetual series of wars with its continental rivals, culminating with their defeat in the during the Napoleonic Wars, and the final settlement at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. During that century, Britain had also established itself as an imperial state. It had extended its imperial territories across the Caribbean, North America, South Asia, and the Pacific. Now, not everything was plain sailing here. This was a deeply contentious process that generated a good deal of political conflict and unrest, as we're going to see today. Now, there traditionally have been two ways of thinking about this process. The first is to emphasize the exceptionalism of Britain, that only Britain was able to achieve this type of miracle of establishing a new type of politically stable imperial state. The old Whig version, which basically grew out of the Revolution of 1688, is that the British had a peculiar genius for stability and compromise. It was part of the, a sort of national characteristics that allowed Britain to achieve this stable state. In contrast, the Marxist version that grew up, or the leftist version that grew up to critique that Whig version, saw it as being founded on a history of state coercion and repression. Historians have more recently developed an argument that has suggested that Britain really isn't that exceptional at all. That actually it looked very much like many other European powers. What distinguished it, however, was its ability to develop what is called a fiscal military state, to basically raise taxes that supported its military and territorial ambitions overseas. And the fierce nationalism that was generated by the hatred of Catholic Europe, of Protestant Britain's hatred of Catholic Europe. Now, the story that I'm going to tell today has elements of all of those stories put together. I'm not going to be telling you that this was an inevitable process. I'm going to be emphasizing instead that it was a highly contingent one, full of conflict, that actually the state remained remarkably insecure for a very long time, and that actually bred an enormous amount of repression and the use of the military capacities of the state to secure itself. Certainly by the end of this period, this image of the Leviathan, which comes from the frontispiece of Thomas Hobbes' book of that name, of this great monstrous figure of the state with a scepter in one hand and a sword in the other, rising over the countryside, was very much achieved by 1819. I've lost my mouse. There we go. Okay, so now let me talk to you about this war-mongering, tax-hungry state and how it was established. As I've suggested, on Tuesday, the revolutionary settlement that developed between 1688 and 1714 sought to resolve the very legitimacy of that new fledgling state. It sought to do a number of things. It sought to try and figure out the rules and the order of succession, and to insist that these were to be determined by Parliament, not by the monarchy. It sought also to constrain the executive power of the monarch by making it a constitutional monarchy that had to act in coordination with Parliament. And the monarchy became dependent upon Parliament for its ability to raise tax revenue to carry out the business of government. And by establishing the Bill of Rights in 1689 to insist that the judicial system would remain separate, and to try and establish the claim that sovereignty rested with the people through Parliament. Another key element of this revolutionary settlement was to insist upon the nature and extent of religious toleration, given that religious wars had torn the country apart over the preceding century and a half. And the Acts of Toleration insisted upon the integrity of the established Anglican Church, the established Protestant Church, Church of the State, but allowed nonconformist Protestants the right to worship, while at the same time banning Catholics and nonconformist dissenters from public office and subjecting them to the taxes of the Anglican Church. All of this in the Act of Toleration of 1689. And finally, the revolutionary settlement sought to figure out the relationship between England, Ireland, and Scotland. But that settlement was a bunch of compromises that masked continuing tensions and potential conflict. Conflict between the Whigs in Parliament who believed that sovereignty rested with the people, who had the right to resist the sovereign, inspired by Locke's two treatises on government of 1689, and Tories who continued to believe in the divine right of kings and the primacy of the Stuart dynasty. Tensions also between nonconformists and Anglicans. Nonconformists had the right to worship, but they continued to be barred from certain offices and from a university education at Oxford and Cambridge and the other universities. Tensions also between England, Scotland, and Ireland. Ireland had been invaded by William of Orange in order to flush out James II, who had fled there after the Revolution of 1688, and he was not defeated until, or his forces were not defeated until 1699. And then a whole series of repressive measures were introduced to assure the ascendancy in Ireland of the minority Protestant population, excluding Catholics from Parliament and from public office, including the army, excluding and not allowing Catholics to possess firearms or to buy or inherit property. And tensions between those primarily in England, in northern England and in Scotland, between those eager to restore James II to the throne, the so-called Jacobites, who continued to forge rebellions in 1694, and then again up in the Scottish Highlands in 1715, 1742, and 1744, 1745. All of this took place in the context of threats, continuing threats of invasion from the Catholic monarchical regimes of France, Spain, and the Austrian Habsburgs. So this was a state struggling to establish itself, not just its internal legitimacy, but its security with the constituent elements of the nation and its rival European powers. In short, the prospects for survival were not looking particularly good. And war would be a continuing feature of this state's attempt to try and secure itself, and war depended upon the ability to raise a lot of money. So how was this made possible? How did the state gather the money it needed to fight these wars? Basically, through the creation of something that our governments now tell us is a very bad thing, which is the idea of the national debt. Two key innovations made the creation of the national debt possible. The first is the creation of the Bank of England in 1694. The bank was formed when the new revolutionary state was on the very edge of bankruptcy, and the possibility of French invasion was very real. And it had run out of money. So what it did was ask for a loan of £1.2 million from this new entity, which in return was given limited liability and the right to issue banknotes. Okay? So it was a deal, basically, between effectively a bunch of creditors and the state in return for the right to establish a bank and to give it certain monopolies. 1.2 million was a lot of money. So in order to service its debts, the state had to raise taxes to pay off the interest. And this was not an easy job. Raising taxes had been part of the reason why the Stuart monarchy had had so much trouble in the 17th century. So at first what they do is cobble together a series of temporary measures of raising money through bonds and securities, of national lotteries and so forth, and a whole host of different types of taxes. Taxes on windows, on horses, on dogs, on the numbers of women servants you have, any number of things, of temporary solutions. But basically, by around the beginning of the 18th century, they settle upon a system. And that system had three principal parts. Land tax, which sometimes could amount to up to 20%. Customs duties on the import of goods from overseas. There have been, between 1690 and 1760, there was something like 800 acts of parliament regarding customs. And between 1760 and 1830, there were an additional 1,300 acts of parliament. Lastly, and probably most importantly, was an indirect sales tax known as the excise. And the excise was gradually expanded over an increasing number of commodities, like beer, like wine, like spirits, soap, coal, coffee, and, of course, tobacco. Now, what's new about this tax was that it was collected in a different type of way. It wasn't collected as customs and land tax were by local assessors, who very often tended to be gentry figures, who could therefore negotiate with their peers how much money they owed the state. It was a sort of individual bargain between the assessor and the taxpayer. Instead, it was collected by a centrally coordinated office, the Excise Office, the Board of Excise, who appointed salaried officers who were afforded certain districts in the country and travelled around those districts collecting taxes. There were over 2,000 of these excise men by 1708. And so effective was this system that it accounted for an increasing percentage of overall government revenue. 29% in 1710 and 52% by 1795. 29% in 1710, 52% by 1795. Altogether, the tax burden on the British population increased 16 times between 1660 and 1850. And that's while its national income only tripled. The only other country that came close to this type of tax burden was the Dutch. Now, that was the fiscal component of this fiscal military state. But the fiscal military state also created something that looks very much like a military industrial complex. And it occurred around the development of the armed forces. That first loan from the Bank of England had been used to fortify the navy to protect the country from French invasion. An enormous amount of money was poured into the navy and to the army during the 18th century. Between 1700 and 1750, the navy manpower and tonnage doubled in size. It was estimated in 1715 that the size of the fleet represented a capital investment of £2.25 million, and maintaining it took £500,000 a year. And that was just the cost of the ships. The major dockyards, like this one you see behind you on the Thames, the Chatham dockyards, were built to build and repair and maintain these enormous ships. The major dockyards employed 8,000 men by 1770. 2,000 men were hired at Portsmouth and Plymouth each. That made it by far the biggest employee in the country, by a mile. When the early woolen and textile mills developed, they often employ like 150 or 200 people. This is a giant industrial enterprise. And the numbers of people aboard those ships also grow dramatically. So at the height of the 7 Years' War in the 1760s, there are 80,000 Britons on board the naval ships. That meant that the supply chain was huge. They consumed, these people on board the ships in the 1760s, 4 million pounds of flour, 11 million pounds of beef, over 4.5 million pounds of biscuits, and 2.5 million pounds of cheese. Not even Costco would have been able to supply the British Navy. And then we're not even talking about the supply of the wood, of the metals, etc., the sails that were needed to keep the Navy in business. The Army is a very similar story. You see behind you the growth in the size of the Army. I've taken these figures from the 9 Years' War from 1689 to 1697, the War of Spanish Succession from 1702 to 13, the American War of 1775 to 83, and the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815. And the army also depends upon the hiring of foreign troops and mercenaries. 25% of the army's budget during the 7 Years' War went on hiring local allies and mercenaries. So, in 1757, when Britain wins the decisive battle in South Asia, called the Battle of Plassey, it was fought with just 750 British soldiers. The rest were basically hired Indian sepoys from their local allies. Overall, then, military expenditure on the army and the navy accounted for over half of all government expenditure during the 18th century and reached a peak of 70% in the decade in the decade of the 7 Years' War. Now, this describes an incredibly powerful state, and I don't want you to be fooled into thinking that was the case. This may have seemed an impregnable state, but in many ways it remained very fragile. It remained a composite type of state, a highly decentralized state made up of many different parts. The new fiscal military apparatus was grafted on top of an older structure. So, for instance, just to give you one I'm going to give you a series of examples of this. So one of the first things that they do is begin to develop roads in order to get the military around the countryside quicker in order to control local populations. And they first do that in the 1720s through the 1740s to build a big road up to Scotland to make sure the Jacobite threat is not realised. But nonetheless, by 1760, it still took 2 weeks, 2 whole weeks, to get from London to Edinburgh by road. Okay? Bear in mind also that, and I'm now going to talk about law and order, that basically Britain has had no effective police force. Local areas might have a local watchman, there might be even a parish constable, but there was no centralised police system. Instead, what there was a standing army that had been allowed in the so-called Disbanding Act of 1699. If you want to create a standing army, very good idea to give it a name, give the name to seem like you're actually getting rid of one. So the Disbanding Act actually allows for the maintenance of a standing army. And there was about 15,000 people in that standing army, and they were all basically mobile horse regiments to allow them to move around the country to put out fires, not literally to put out fires, but to put out disorder and rebellion wherever it was needed. The Riot Act of 1716 enabled local magistrates, so-called justices of the peace, to read a riot act when the disorder was fermenting and then summon in the local regiment to put it down. So in 1757, 20 regiments were deployed to suppress riots all across the country. And most famously, in this image you see behind me, during the Gordon riots of 1780, 12,000 troops were needed to suppress the rioting that broke out. It was an anti-Catholic riot that broke out over 5 or 6 days in London. Now, there weren't any methods of crowd control. Okay? There wasn't a pepper spray a la UC Davis. You know, there wasn't any highly developed forms of crowd control. Instead, what they did was basically issue warnings, charge at crowds on horseback, and fire shots at them. And very often, when they failed to disperse, then real shots were fired at them. 285 people died during the Gordon riots as a consequence of troops firing upon them. It's also important to emphasize that the centralized state outside of the revenue departments were incredibly small. There was really very few government employees outside of those revenue officers. So, to give you an example, there were only 150 departments, only 150 employees in those so-called civilian departments in 1688. By 1750, that had risen to 2,500, but still, particular ministries had very few people. The Board of Trade in 1815 had just 20 officials in it. The Home Office, at the same time, had just 17. The Foreign Office had 30. Okay, these are huge government state departments, and they're manned by very few people. The basic unit of government tended to be local, okay, and it tended to be done at the level of the parish or the town. There were around 200 towns that boasted their own royal charters as separate corporations and had their own system of government through mayors, aldermen, and councillors. Most people had a type of parochial, a parish. The unit of administration that surrounded the church was the primary unit of government for most people. There are about 10,000 parishes spread across England, and they all had church wardens who were normally local farmers or property owners, and they were putatively elected by members of the parish. And then they appointed people as voluntary officials, unpaid voluntary officials, to do the work that parishes do, which was to relieve the poor, to provide poor relief, to maintain roads, and to raise the militia. So in other words, I'm saying this is a patchwork quilt of a state, okay, that's remained highly dependent upon very local forms of government. And I haven't even touched upon the separate forms of civilian government in Scotland or in counties, because I don't have time. But I will maybe come back to that on another occasion. So any questions before we move on to this next section, where America is going to get a lead-in role?
You said that there was no centralized police force at the time. Do you mean centralized as in like still like under national structure, or was there a centralization among like the parishes?
No, they were the particular parishes might appoint a person to walk around and try and keep order. The armies, that was a combination of these local militias and an army that was putatively the army of the state. And so local magistrates could call upon those regiments to come and put out order. But basically, apart from that, there is no form of policing at all. Okay, yeah. What's your name? Eric. Of course. Mm-hmm. In London? Oh, for sure, yes. I mean, there's a significant minority population of Catholics, the size of which I couldn't actually give you off the top of my head. But there remained a sizable number of Catholics, both aristocratic Catholics and increasingly in the late 18th and 19th century, Catholics who moved between Britain and Ireland in sort of, as part of sort of migrant labour flows. Okay. What I'm now going to try and talk about very briefly is the sort of political system that authorized this state and the forms of criticisms that developed, that allowed to develop of the state. So at the apex of this system, both the new and the old system, was the monarchy and the parliament, the very idea of the constitutional monarchy that had been established in 1688. It's important to remember that the monarchy remained the dominant political force throughout much of the 18th century. It was the monarch who appointed ministers to carry out their policies. And it was the monarch who basically had the ability to create a system of patronage, to appoint people into positions as government officials, members of the armed service, and even as clergy of the established Anglican Church. Now, the idea of a governing cabinet begins to develop in the 18th century. And that idea comes from the idea that the monarch becomes increasingly dependent upon ministers as his advisors, who he would group together in a cabinet to discuss the pressing matters of state. And even by the 1730s and 1740s, there's the development of an idea that amongst those ministerial advisors to the monarch, there would be a prime minister, someone who increasingly was seen to be the spokesperson for the government as a whole. But that very idea is only beginning to develop in the 1730s and 1740s. There were divisions within Parliament, and Parliament had been around for several centuries and had members of Parliament, so-called MPs, who by this time identified as Whigs or Tories. And Whigs and Tories were basically arguing over the nature of the revolutionary settlement and how it should be best secured, what right there should be for how wide religious toleration of dissenters should go, whether the authority rested ultimately with the monarch and its hereditary rights or through Parliament, and whether the source of wealth was through trade and commerce, which was the Whig position, or overseas colonization of land as the basis of wealth, which was basically the Tory position. Many MPs, though, spurned those party labels entirely and thought of themselves as simply representing a local interest, very often the local interest of the aristocrat that patronized them and allowed them to stand in their electoral district. So these MPs have been elected by a system that had developed over centuries. Before the 1640s, basically most MPs have been selected rather than elected. That is to say that local notables would say, I need you to stand in Parliament for me to represent my interests. After the 1640s, electoral districts tend to have an increasing number of contests, of election contests, where votes were returned for rival candidates. But even then, nobody really knew how elections was going to work. Nobody really knew who should have the vote or how they should vote. All of that stuff was up for grabs. And it was really only after 1688 that electoral system, that is the very beginning of the system that we live with both in the United Kingdom and in the United States, began to develop and be codified. And that was because there was an increasing number of elections held. There were 12 elections held in the immediate aftermath of the Revolution of 1688, between 1689 and 1715. And so much turmoil did that seem to create that they produced a thing that said, okay, we'll only do it every 7 years. So there was a Septennial Act passed in order to reduce the number of contests. After the Act of Union in 1707, there are basically 558 MPs elected by 314 electoral districts or constituencies. And 245 of them were in England. And there are two types of constituencies, ones that represented boroughs, urban towns, and those that were represented counties, which were the rural areas. And all of these constituencies, all of these electoral districts had very, very different types of electoral qualifications. So who got to vote it varied enormously across those places. And that meant that the size of those electorates varied enormously. Some only had 1 or 2 voters. Others there were 30 boroughs that had over 1,000 electors. So again, this is a hodgepodge of a system. But it's a system that grows during the 18th century. The numbers of people elected, the number of people voting rose quite significantly during the 18th century for 2 reasons. One, some forms of the vote were linked to property, and the values of property were inflating during the 18th century. And the other reason is that the size of the British population was increasing even more dramatically. So although the total number of voters increases as a percentage of the total population, it actually declines from 4.6% in 1689 to 3.2% in 1831. Now, the crisis for this system came after the 7 Years' War. This was the big global war of the 18th century. It was a war basically between Britain and France, and then eventually Portugal and Spain, for the control of territories across the Mediterranean, the Americas, the Caribbean, South Asia, and West Africa. At the end of that war, Britain emerges triumphant and extends its colonial territories. It secures Canada and gets Quebec and Newfoundland. it gets Florida as part of its North American colonies, and it takes control of South Asia. But George III, who was then king, had an advisor called Lord Bute, a Scottish advisor called Lord Bute, who was deeply criticised for their handling of the peace. Britain had won the war, but many people thought they lost the peace because in that peace agreement they agreed to hand back Cuba and the Philippines, Martinique and Grenada. And many people thought that that was an unpatriotic thing, to surrender territories that had been conquered. And the other reason why this was a moment of crisis, and the people were very critical of Bute and George III, was that the cost of the war had been so immense that a whole new series of taxes were introduced in order to cover its costs. So there then grows an increasing amount of dissent that begins first in Britain and then finds very important echoes in the North American colonies. In Britain, the story revolves around this delightful figure, John Wilkes, portrayed here very unkindly, is arguably the most ugly man in the world by the the satirical artist William Hogarth in 1763. Wilkes was an MP. He was a libertine, a good time boy, enjoyed his life very much, enjoyed the company of many people and good lashings of alcohol. But he got into hot water not for his personal behavior, but because he did something that was unprecedented. He criticized in his journal, The North Briton, in the issue number 45, alluding to the Jacobite Rebellion of 1945, remember Lord Bute is a Scot, criticizing the King's speech for the outlining of the peace terms of the 7 Years' War. This was the first time that the King had been personally criticized by a member of Parliament. So immediately, a warrant for his arrest for seditious libel was issued. But the problem was, if you're a member of Parliament, you can't be arrested for seditious libel. You're above the law. So what the House of Commons does is eject him from his seat. So Wilkes then has to flee to France to avoid arrest, and he becomes a cause célèbre as a consequence. One of the most populous and democratic of all constituencies was the constituency of Middlesex, which was in London, and it elected Wilkes in defiance of George III 3 times between 1768 and 1769. Every time they elected him, he was denied a seat by the officials at the House of Commons. This creates a huge popular campaign in support of Wilkes. There are 27 petitions collected around the country in 1769 in his support, including petitions from the North American colonies. And eventually he's arrested on his return to the UK and re-elected to Parliament in 1774. Now Wilkes begins to, where actually one of the things he does is campaign for the publication of debates in the House of Commons to try and make the proceedings of Parliament legible to the people who elected these representatives. So Wilkes stands in for the cause of liberty, for the rights of the people to elect their own representatives, freedom of election, freedom of the press, that the press should be able to say what it wants to say, and freedom for the people to be able to follow debates in the House of Commons. Now, the Wilkes episode demonstrated the so-called use of arbitrary powers by the king and his ministers. And that echoed heavily in the North American colonies, which, after the 7 Years' War, were being sucked in to a much tighter political and military and financial control by the imperial center. Okay? I'm not going to go over this ground because you all know this by rote. But this contest over the tightening military and financial and political control in the 13 colonies obviously culminated in the Declaration of Independence and the 6 years of, for the British, a very expensive and ultimately unsuccessful war to defeat the I'm trying to find a neutral term here and failing. The rebels in the American colonies, let me say that. Now, there are many people in Britain, and you see them behind me here, Thomas Paine, who writes A Common Sense in support of the American rebels, Richard Price, and John Cartwright, all write saying this is the beginning of the big change, that the right to representation without taxation, the right to no taxation without representation established by Wilkes and by the American colonists should be the basis of the development of the representative structure. So, at the end of this period of time, in the 1760s and 1770s, when there's a big petitioning campaign, what we have on record is a growing critique of the expense and the unrepresentative nature of this new state that had grown out of the revolution of 1688. And the tax burden that had been placed upon its people had moved to the center of the political stage. So I'm skipping over, obviously, a vast amount of territory here. But the point that I want you to get from this section is that the growth of the state is not neutral. It doesn't succeed at legitimating itself and authorizing its use of power outside of the representative system or the growing tax burden that is being placed upon its people. In other words, the fiscal military state generates a critique of it that comes out of the very representative structures that are meant to be at the heart of the new system that comes out of 1688. Do we have any questions before we move on? I've ground you all down already. Yes, I'm suggesting that the growing criticisms that develop from Wilkes and through the American rebels highlights the very unrepresentative nature of the state and its inefficient nature, that it depends upon this enormous tax burden upon the people. And at the heart of that was the corrupt use of that money, which I'm going to move on to now. I'm going to have to do this very quickly. So, move from North America to South Asia. Britain loses its North American colonies, and it reorientates its imperial vision to South Asia, to a new imperial destiny. And it does that through this very strange organization known as the East India Company that had been set up in 1600 and given basically by the early 18th century monopoly trading rights in South Asia in return for certain lines of credit and tax revenue to help feed this hungry new state. Now, what happens after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, when Britain secures its military control in South Asia and beat basically the French and Portuguese competitors in the area, is that Britain becomes the de facto controller of South Asia through the East India Company. That control becomes even tighter in 1765, when the military hero of that campaign, Robert Clive, secures from the emperor, from the Mughal emperor, the right to tax the people of Bengal and collect what is known as the Diwani. And so the East India Company now has the right to tax the people of Bengal in return, ostensibly, for military protection and the rule of law. So the East India Company becomes a de facto sovereign ruler, which is at this point beyond the jurisdiction of Crown or the Parliament. So immediately what happens is that British Parliament tries to wrest control back from the East India Company in a whole series of different types of ways. It insists on an income of $400,000 a year, and a limit of the amount of dividends paid to shareholders, and it passes the Regulating Act in 1773 to appoint a parliamentary approved Governor General of its territories in South Asia. It's the first occupant of that position of Governor General, Warren Hastings, who becomes subject to the savage critique of Edmund Burke in his impeachment trial in 1788. Edmund Burke had been one of those people who had been sympathetic to the rebels in the American colonies. He was a Whig who was in favor of economical reform, the shrinking of the size of offices of the state. And his criticism of Hastings was that he became, as you can see in the reading that you've done, the Governor General of iniquity, that he had overseen Burke accused of immense immense corruption and violence against the peoples of South Asia. That his rule had had a corrosive effect on South Asian society, and this for Burke was not what an empire should do. An empire should have a sanguine, a beneficial effect upon the people, and it should rule in accordance with those people's wishes. Burke basically wanted to make imperialism less corrupt and exploitative. Okay? But the conceit of the argument is that you could have an empire, you could do imperialism without exploitation. Okay? Burke believed that there was a good way of being an imperialist. Now, that criticism of the corruption at the heart of the East India Company rule of South Asia also energized a critique of what was known as aristocratic old corruption in Britain itself. And again, the attention was on the wasteful and corrupt distribution of government offices. The government offices were by appointment of ministers and the Crown. It led to this proliferation of cosy positions with great big pensions, of people being given parliamentary seats, etc., all of which, they argued, placed a greater tax burden upon the British people. Okay, so this unrepresentative system was now not just unrepresentative, it was corrupt and inefficient and burdening the very people it was meant to represent. 1788 is a big year because it's also the centenary year of the Glorious Revolution. And it's the occasion for many reflections upon the outcome of the revolutionary settlement. And so all the big reformers and thinkers of the time reflect upon where Britain is 100 years after this so-called revolutionary settlement. So Richard Price, the dissenting philosopher, writes his discourse on the love of country, basically outlining the way in which the rights of dissenters and the representative nature of the revolution had not been sufficient. And this happens, of course, also in the wake not just of the centenary revolution, but in the shadow of the French Revolution in 1789. So for Edmund Burke, the Whig critic of Warren Hastings, now switches sides, effectively. Burke now, basically, in his response to Price, says, look, you can't possibly have a system in which is not based upon precedent. You can't have constitutions based on new principles. They have to be built upon the authority of the past. And then comes the far more radical responses to Burke by Thomas Paine, again, remember, key supporter of the American Revolution, and Mary Wollstonecraft, both of whom try and expand the democratic potential. Burke by saying, look, this has nothing to do with history. Sovereignty lies with the people, and all men should have a say in the election of the governments that rule them. And 1688 didn't do that, but the revolutions in the North American colonies and the revolution in France comes much closer to the ideal. And then, of course, Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the first leading feminists in Britain, argues not that women should also have the vote, but that women should have the education so that they might be part of the public discussion of the nature of the state. Now, the publication of Thomas Paine's Rights of Man really energizes a radical reforming movement. And there are basically three key organizations that advance these arguments for radical reform. The Society for Constitutional Information, headed up by Major John Cartwright, the Friends of the People in Scotland, and the London Corresponding Society in London, which was pledged to a Painite agenda, and opened itself up to supposedly members unlimited, i.e. to all people. And finally, the United Irishmen in Ireland, led by the Protestant lawyer Wolfe Tone. Pledged, it was formed in 1792, the United Irishmen pledged to obtain, quote, an equal, full and adequate representation of all the people of Ireland, irrespective of their religion. Okay, so Tone is basically a Protestant lawyer arguing that all people in Ireland, not just Protestants, should have the vote. Okay, I'm not going to pause for questions because I have about 10 minutes to finish off this packed, caffeine-fueled lecture. The growth of the radical reform movement is truly scary for the defenders of the status quo and of the new type of imperial state. In 1792, the king makes a proclamation against seditious writing, and Paine is immediately arrested, as is his publisher. In August of 1792, the Republic is declared in France, and by January 1793, the king is executed there, and Republican France declares war upon Britain. This fuels a loyalist backlash. In 1792, a new organization, the Association for Preserving Liberty and Property Against Republicans and Levelers, could claim over 2,000 local groups affiliated to it. And this wave of loyalist support, of patriotic loyalist support, was whipped up by new government-funded newspapers with titles like The Sun, not like the Sun that is currently published in Britain, The True Briton, and The Anti-Jacobin. The very titles give you a sense of their politics. And satirical artists like James Gilroy are hired to portray radicals in demonizing ways. But it wasn't just about the mobilization of people in support of church and state. It was also about the application of a new wave of state violence, what the radicals would end up describing as Britain's system of terror, in reference to the terror that was developing in the French Revolution. The leaders of the Scottish Friends of the People were charged with sedition and transported to Australia in 1793. The leaders of the London Corresponding Society and the Society for Constitutional Information were arrested for treasonable practices in 1794. Habeas corpus, the right to appear before a court when you're arrested, was suspended in order to deal with radical leaders. None of this put out the fire of radical reform. And in 1795, the London Corresponding Society manages to get 10,000 people to this meeting in London's Copenhagen fields. But the meeting breaks up, and members of the meeting end up throwing stones at the King's carriage on his way to open Parliament. Okay? This is basically the end. And immediately, a whole series of new repressive measures are introduced. In 1795, the Gagging Acts, which allowed magistrates to basically outlaw all potentially seditious public meetings. It expanded the definition of what treason was, and completely served to close down the movement for radical reform. The following year, the rebellion of the United Irishmen across the sea between 1796 and 1798 is brutally crushed at the cost of 12,000 Irish lives. And then finally in 1799 and 1800, the Combination Acts are introduced that allowed magistrates to imprison anyone for 3 months that sought to create an organization of working men, of any type of association. Radicalism, it's been argued, went underground as a consequence of that. It didn't go away. And it revives with the return of peace at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars were the wars with revolutionary France that had basically lasted 22 years and had cost over £1 billion and had meant that the national debt had grown to an unprecedented level of 745 million. This led to a series of retrenchment measures by the state, which I don't have time to detail, that created new levels of austerity and hardship for most of the population, and significantly was combined with the introduction of the Corn Laws to protect British agriculture from the import of cheap grain from overseas, to protect, in other words, the aristocratic interests of landowners who owned the land that was farmed, and not to protect the rights of ordinary Britons. So into this mess of a very costly war and new levels of austerity, a new generation of radical leaders like William Cobbett and Henry Hunt arise from the ashes. Cobbett has his political register. There's also a famous radical magazine called, a newspaper called The Black Dwarf, and all of them highlight the extent of all corruption, the extent of the tax burden, and the tyrannical violence that was rained down on the people. There are a variety of attempts at insurrection across Britain in 1816 and 1817, an attempt to create an insurrection in London's Spa Fields, in Manchester with the Blanketers March, in Derbyshire with the so-called Pendrick Rising. All of these are very small, okay, but it shows that insurrection is growing around the country. And by 1819, the calls for radical reform had grown so large, with Henry Hunt at the lead of the movement, that a huge crowd of 50,000 people gather in central Manchester on St. Peter's Fields in August 1819 to hear Henry Hunt, the great orator, argue for the necessity of radical reform. The local magistrate reads the Riot Act and sends in the cavalry. 14 men and 4 women are killed as a consequence of their stampede of the proceedings. A further 650 people, including over 150 women, were injured. And the editor of the local newspaper, the Manchester Observer, Edward Rowe, and you can read this online, published a report of what he termed the Peterloo Massacre, referring to, obviously, the defeat of Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. After Peterloo, the infamous 6 Acts are introduced. Any reform meeting that seems to be an overt act of treasonable conspiracy was outlawed. The radical press was muzzled with new stamp duties, new taxes on publication. There were stricter definitions of blasphemy and seditious libel, and the magistrates were given new powers to prevent any type of meeting over 50 people. This was the final triumph, I'm suggesting, of the new imperial state that had been established in the wake of the Revolution of 1688. That it takes over a century for that state to have the might and the security to contain its critics overseas and at home. And I will go straight into some final words so we can all breathe. So, very quickly, what I've been trying to say, convey to you today, is that the first part of this story is that a new type of state grew in the aftermath of the revolutionary settlement of 1688 to 1714. A new type of fiscal military state was engrafted on top of the older structures of that state. And that created something that looked far from an omnipotent state, but actually a composite state with highly decentralized powers. Okay? And that created the forums, if you like, the representative systems that allowed eventually for a critique of that new state to emerge. And that critique centered upon whether it was in the American colonies or whether it was in London or in Manchester, that critique focused upon the corrupt use of government offices, the extent of the tax burden upon the British people, and the use of arbitrary power to suppress alternative points of view. All of those things was true across the British Empire, from South Asia to North America to Britain. And this shows the tightening grip of a new type of imperial state. That the very creation of that state catalyzes its critics across its imperial reach. Those critics are then met with an unprecedented level of state violence and repression. So a state that putatively is set up with some measure of popular sovereignty, some claim to be representative of the people, ends up creating all of these emergency laws and conditions in which new forms of state violence can be enacted. And I'm suggesting that that is representative of the fragility of that new state and its ability to overcome, ultimately, that fragility through its use of violence. So, in other words, Britain becomes the preeminent state, world state, in 1815, certainly the preeminent European state after centuries of war, not because the British people are inherently brilliant at creating forms of stable government, but out of a deeply contentious and conflictual process. And that was the real legacy of the long 18th century in Britain. And on that note, I will end. And I do promise you that I will not have so much ground to cover. I had to give you get you deeply into the 18th century. So this is a truly intense week with a lot of reading and a very busy lecture. And next week, I hope, will be a little bit easier.